Welcome. My name is Olivia Mattis, and today we're presenting a beautiful program on American Jews who fought in the Spanish Civil War. I'm welcoming you on behalf of my own organization, the Sousa Mendes Foundation, and also on behalf of our partner for today's program, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, ALBA. So today, we're focusing on a story that's very connected to the history that we at the Sousa Mendes Foundation present. We honor a Portuguese rescuer named Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who saved thousands of lives during World War II. He was stationed in Bordeaux, France, and issued Portuguese visas to desperate fleeing refugees. And for these refugees to get from Bordeaux, France to Portugal, of course, they had to cross through Spain. And every testimonial we have from these visa recipients speaks about the devastation of the Spanish landscape that had just ended the Spanish Civil War about 9 months earlier. Many visa recipients refer to that trip through Spain by train as going through Dante's Inferno. So that history is so intimately connected to the history of our foundation. And today we're going to take a deep dive into that history and see how it connects to the issues that animate the themes of rescue and resistance that we promote at the Sousa Mendes Foundation. I'm delighted that today we have a moderator who is Professor Gina Herrmann from the University of Oregon. She's a specialist in Spanish literature and in Holocaust studies. And so she will moderate the program on behalf of ALBA and herself as a professional. She also found today's wonderful speakers, and I'll let her introduce them. But before we go to Gina, just to set the mood, we have a little video to play for you of the singer John McCutcheon.
From the farms, from the cities, from every land came the Abe Lincoln Brigade, with a dream in their hearts and a gun in their hands, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. No, pass it on, no, pass it on, so sang the Abe Lincoln Brigade. Across the years and the oceans we still sing the song of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Cries from the cities, the shouts from the hills, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. The fire in the hearts that is warming us still, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. No, pass it on, no, pass it on, so sang the Abe Lincoln Brigade. Across the years and the oceans we still sing the song of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Workers who died, oh, the Abe Lincoln Brigade. Their stories still thrill me. We work side by side with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. No, pass it on, no, pass it on, so sang the Abe Lincoln Brigade. Across the years and the oceans we still sing the song of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. So raise glasses and voices give them a toast. Oh, the Abe Lincoln Brigade. Those who die best are the ones who live most, like the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. No, pass it on, no, pass it on, so sang the Abe Lincoln Brigade. Across the years and the oceans, we still sing the song of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. No, pass it on, no, pass it on, so sang the Abe Lincoln Brigade. Across the years and the oceans, we still sing the song of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade.
Thank you, Olivia, for your introduction. I'm Gina Herrmann. I'm your moderator today and a longtime member of the Executive Committee of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archive, ALBA. And I'm thrilled to welcome this wonderful, big audience today for this special podcast about Jews in the Spanish Civil War. I want to thank Olivia and the Sousa Mendes Foundation for reaching out to us to prepare this programming. We have so many links in our missions through the theme of anti-fascist resistance. So to you all, welcome and salud. Before presenting our invited guests, let me say a few words about ALBA's origins, mission, and current work. The Spanish Civil War took place between 1936 and 39, and it was the Western world's first battle against fascism. Almost 40,000 men and women from 52 countries, including 2,800 American volunteers, traveled to Spain and joined the international brigades to fight fascism. The U.S. volunteers served in various units and came to be known collectively as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. What was originally a veterans organization has evolved into the ALBA that we know today, an educational not-for-profit dedicated to promoting social activism and the defense of human rights. ALBA's work is inspired by the American volunteers of the brigade, and we draw on rich archival collections in New York University's Tammerman Library. And working to expand these collections, we preserve the legacy of the Lincolns as an inspiration for present and future generations, and the materials in our archives are also at the core of our educational mission. We work towards a more widespread, profound, and nuanced awareness of the history of America's progressive traditions. And we work with high school students, high school teachers, college students, scholars, and the public at large. We hope and intend that this awareness allows progressive communities in the United States and elsewhere to develop effective strategies to meet the present and future challenges faced by the world and to build a more just and better society. So let me just talk very briefly about our educational mission. You know, in the United States, if the Spanish Civil War is mentioned at all in high school classrooms, it's really presented as a side note. You can imagine a high school textbook that has one of those little narrative boxes on the side that you might want to pay attention very briefly to this story over here. So it's presented as a sidebar to a much larger narrative about the Great Depression, leading into World War II, leading into the Cold War. And we at ALBA disagree with this representation of the Spanish Civil War, and we think that the 3 years, that were fought in Spain were pivotal. Pivotal because the war poses the question that remains so pertinent and urgent today about what individuals and collectives should do in the face of authoritarianism and fascism. The U.S. stood by during the first war against fascism as if what was happening in Spain was not of concern to major democracies. So one thing that's so fascinating about the primary sources, the writings, the interviews, the testimonies, as you'll hear from our invited guests, is that the veterans demonstrate, that is, people who lived through the history at the time were totally convinced, they understood that what was happening in Spain was of world importance. Sometimes you have to defy authority for ethical principles, and this is at the core of ALBA's educational mission, and it resonates with young people today. So we're going to put up a really truncated and insufficient timeline. Briefly summarizing the causes of the Spanish Civil War is not easy. But let's just have a quick review of the main themes. The Spanish Civil War broke out in July of 1936 after a group of conservative military tried to overthrow a progressive, reformist-minded Second Spanish Republic, a government of the Popular Front that had been elected in February of that same year. So the military rebels and the oligarchy and the church that supported them were surprised that Spain threw up a massive popular resistance, particularly in large urban centers. In a matter of days, the country was split in half, one zone controlled by the government known as Republicans or Loyalists or Reds, and the other controlled by the rebels, also referred to as nationalist fascists. 3 years of bloody civil war ensued. Franco quickly emerged as the nationalist commander-in-chief, and the war ended with a nationalist victory on April 1, 1939. Franco would rule in Spain as a ruthless dictator until his peaceful death in his bed at 1975, excuse me. And at the end of the war in 1939, there was a phenomenon called the Retirada, which meant that nearly 500,000 Spaniards had to flee across the border into France to escape the new totalitarian fascist state. The Spanish Civil War claimed an estimated 500,000 dead. Of our American volunteers, about 1/3 died in Spain. Many of the remaining veterans continued their fight against fascism during World War II, returning to the theater of war to continue their fight against totalitarian governments, as did, of course, thousands of Republican exiles who found themselves primarily in France. With their help, fascism was finally defeated in 1945. But not for Spain, as we know. Ironically, the outbreak of the Cold War helped secure Franco's position as Spain's anti-communist dictator. And only after his death in 1975 did Spain finally become a democracy. I want to invite you to look at ALBA's website, where we have a more thorough and nuanced history of the Spanish Civil War, both as a Spanish piece of Spanish history, a uniquely Spanish story, but also within the frame of the larger fight against fascism during World War II and, of course, after. So let me now turn to our invited guests. I'm very excited to be able to have two experts on our theme today. Who have spent many years thinking and living the history and the memory and the legacy of the Spanish Civil War. Our Joe Butwin has recently retired from nearly 50 years of teaching English, literature, and Judaic studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. Some 30 years ago, between 1992 and 1994, Joe crossed the country recording conversations with Jewish veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And then he let the tapes and transcripts lie unattended until he revived the project a few years ago, creating a website in Jewish studies at the University of Washington, where you can hear the voices of men and women who went to Spain in 1937 and follow along with Joe's commentary to these testimonies. Most recently, he's prepared 5 testimonial transcripts that will soon be published in Spanish in Spain. And in Spanish, the title is Salud y Shalom, Conversaciones con excombatientes judíos de la Brigada Abraham Lincoln. In English, Salud and Shalom, Conversations with Jewish ex-combatants of the Lincoln Brigade. Professor Tony Geist and Edward Baker translated and helped edit these texts, and we really look forward to its eventual publication in America. Nancy Wallach is our second guest. She's an award-winning art educator who has been a longtime executive committee member of ALBA. She's going to speak to us about her father, Hy Wallach, who was a volunteer in Spain and who served for many years as the treasurer as well as corresponding secretary of the veterans of the Lincoln Brigade. She is on the ALBA's Board of Governor, and among her very important work in representing Alba internationally. She recently participated in a program organized in Burgos, Spain, with their anti-fascist committee, an event that dealt with the recent exhumations of mass graves of Republican victims of fascist violence in Spain, mass graves in prisons in Burgos. And she provided there, during this event, testimony as to her father's own incarceration at the fascist concentration camp for International Brigade prisoners at San Pedro de Cardeña. So thank you again for this wonderful collaboration. And I would like now to pass the word to Joe. I will just say that we are monitoring the chat, but of course, with such a large audience, I hope you understand that we may not be able to get to even many of your questions and comments. Joe.
Okay, thank you, Gina. I should say that in the almost 50 years that Gina mentioned as a working scholar, the work that I've done with the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade is distinct from anything else that I've done, insofar as my subjects, if I can call them that, my subjects became, in many instances, my friends. And I'd like to dedicate anything that I say today that we say together to them. We picked our title, both for this program and for the publication programs that I've generated, the words Salud y Shalom. They were the typical valediction on the part of one of my correspondents that began before I met him, Ed Lending, whose picture you actually see at the right hand of the logo for today's program. As a young man, as an older man in Fort Lauderdale, he wrote to me before our first meeting that he feels, as you'll see, that he feels, I feel like I'll be soul bearing with a younger alter ego. Now, not all friendships took quite that form, but that sets the tone for many of the interviews that conversations, I prefer to the word interview, that I had traveling around the country. Then he writes, Salud y Shalom. He's riffing and playing off a common valediction in letters from Spain at the time, Salud y Victoria. Salud y Shalom links our themes, the Spanish and the Judaic with the Yiddish Hebrew greeting, Shalom. The relation between the two, separated by the Spanish y, looks pretty cozy. What I found in my series of conversations that it was never so cozy as that. The Judaic presence in Spain on the part of Americans and internationals remained largely unmentioned for years, and I mean on the left. First person whom I spoke to, and one of the men who generated the project to begin with out of Alba, was a man named George Watt, who described to me an experience that he had only recently at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Israel, where he listened to the guide, understandably emphasizing Jewish resistance in Vilna and in Warsaw as the primary, indeed, first Jewish resistance to fascism. And at that moment, George said, in effect, where were we? Unmentioned. Nowhere was it mentioned that there were also Jews, he told me, who fought Hitler long before in Spain. Now, whether we fought over out of our Jewishness, that's another question. Well, it's a question that I asked person after person, whether or not it could be said that they fought in Spain, and not all of them fought. Many of them went as medical workers, and they emphasized that when we spoke. I didn't go to fight, I went to save lives, said the nurses. So my two questions really were, how do account first for the fact that fully 1/3 of the Americans who went to Spain were Jewish. And across the board in the international brigades from all countries, it would be at about 20% Jewish participation. How to account for that? And also how to account for the relative silence on the subject at the time and thereafter, until people like George Watt and Bill Sussman, whom you'll hear from right now, began to talk it up and look for explanation and understanding in 1992, which, remember, my first conversations were dated about 3 months after the fall of the Soviet Union. So people were in a mood to assess their lives. I write now at retirement, I'm about the age of the people whom I interviewed 30 years ago. I know a little bit about retrospection, and that's what we did. The question that I might raise with each of them was immediately dismissed. Nobody whom I spoke to said Hitler was a complete reprobate, he hated Jews, and I went to Spain to fight for my Jewish brothers and sisters. Nobody said that. In fact, they dismissed that as a question. They preferred the language that they used then and maintained. I went to Spain as an anti-fascist. I went to Spain as an internationalist, not as a narrow nationalist, where they might regard a Jew fighting for Jews as a kind of a narrow definition. They preferred the broad internationalist position. And yet, when I talked to them over and over again, the stories turned back, began with childhood, with parents, with early education. And as Bill Sussman said, I was born to go to Spain. So you might ask, what does that mean, to be born to go to Spain? It doesn't mean anything genetic. I'm quite sure it doesn't. But here we see him as a child of 6, 7 years old with his parents and brother in Bridgeport, Connecticut, sitting on the lap of Morris Winchevsky, the famous Zayde, the grandfather of Yiddish-speaking Bundist socialism in Europe, in England, and at this point in America. Now, Morris Winchevsky came of age in the 1880s, which provided in Russia a crash course in injustice across the board. After the assassination of Alexander II in 1881, the Russian official position in Russia lowered the boom, particularly on Jews, as possibly responsible for the assassination, certainly as scapegoats. That period was followed by deadly pogroms and restrictive laws that made life more and more difficult for simply survival of Jews in Eastern Europe. In this case, Jews resisted, and they resisted with movements that were new at the time: Zionism, Bundist socialism, Yiddish language and literature, Yiddish journalism. Shalom Aleichem, the great Yiddish writer, is the same generation as Morris Winchevsky, also coming of age as a writer in the Yiddish language in the 1880s. Most important for our interest today with American vets is that it are the 2 million, at least 2 million Jews who left Eastern Europe in the 1880s, 90s, and down to the First World War, and settled in America, mostly to a great number, at least in New York City, but spreading out around the country and bringing with them their early education, their piety, religious piety for many, their socialist principles for many others, who would train their children in those values that were generated at home in their Heim, in the old country, and persisted in the Yiddish schools that they sent their children to, the famous Schulen, where children, it's a kind of a counterculture to Hebrew school, would go after school and study Yiddish language, literature, and socialism. I would say nearly half the people I talked to attended those schools. And for Bill Sussman, the path led, as it did for many, from the Yiddish Shul to Young Communist League to Spain in 1937. The decision made in the 1930s, and I want to emphasize this, bore more relation to events in Russia in the 1880s, perhaps, even than to, or at least as much as current events in the 1930s. The difference being that what happened in the 1880s had everything to do with Jewishness, with being Jewish. If that gap, incidentally, sounds unlikely, it sounds like history, from the 1930s to the 1880s, I would remind you that the events of this past year, for instance, Black Lives Matter, I would suggest, has a lot to do with events and ideologies made available in the 1960s, right? I think you'd probably all agree. That's 50 years ago, 50 plus. That's the 1930s to the 1880s. I also want to emphasize in all of the stories the important bridge between childhood and a young adult decision to go to Spain. Early education matters. When we look at pictures that Celia Saborer presented to me, she went as a nurse. Well, actually, she went as a lab tech. She was one of the first Americans in Spain. She actually did arrive in 1936 to serve as a lab tech in Madrid and became, as she put it, overnight a nurse. But here she is 20 years earlier in an open field in Brooklyn. She laughed when she showed me this picture. Already on the right, a young nurse with her neighborhood buddies playing soldier and nurse, sexual distinction being made, in an empty lot in Brooklyn, playing the role that she would, in effect, 20 years later in Spain. And there we see her as a real medical worker, if you will, fulfilling her early promise. The family history would come up over and over again in conversations by way of explanation of who I am and who I became. That's particularly true in the case of George Watt, the man who had that revelation at Yad Vashem about his own Jewishness and his participation. Here we see George, 1938, as an officer in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And let's listen to his commentary on, in effect, on the photograph on the right of the screen. That is, where we see the strikers in Lodz. Somewhere in that picture, we are to understand, sits his grandfather. Let's listen to George.
Yeah. But there was something else in the family. Ever since as long as I can remember, there was a legend in our family around my grandfather, my father's father. My father's father was was a textile worker, a weaver, in Lodz. And he worked in a factory which was owned by a Jewish boss. And his factory was the place where they had the first strike of Jewish workers in Lodz in 1903, the Schlitsky factory in Lodz. And ever since I was a kid, that my father told a story, which was part of our family tradition. He was not a rabbi, but he was considered very learned. And he was called Avremel Langenbod, or Avremel the Lamdim. Abraham, you know Yiddish, of course, right? Okay.
Enough.
enough. He was known as the Lamden, and he was one of the elder workers in the plant who was became active in this strike, and he was one of the leaders of the strike. Not the leader, but one of the leaders. And my father always told the story, and he said how they were arrested by the Tsarist police, because this was Russian Poland then, Tsar, under the Tsar. They arrested by, and he described how he, as a 6-year-old boy, watched his father being taken in shackles, and the punishment in those days where they forced you to walk on foot back to your village of origin. See, many of the people living in Lodz had emigrated or had moved from the smaller outlying surrounding villages into Lodz, where you had industry and they became workers and so on. This was part of the process taken. And he had to move back to his home staple, a real staple, in Cape, in chains. And this was a story I always remembered. And so that was part of our tradition. In other words, my grandfather, the pride that we had in my grandfather who led the strike, the first strike of Jewish workers in Lodz, 1903, that's around the time leading up to the 1905 revolution. So that's part of our tradition.
Now let's keep in mind that this is a man who's explaining to me over the course of a few days why he went to Spain in 1937. But what's instrumental, and it was really one of the first things that he showed me with real pride, was that photograph of his grandfather, is the family tradition. Now, if you listen to what he said, the language is interesting. He tells the story as he calls it, a legend, a tradition, and then several times a story. It's not history. As a matter of fact, his history is a little off. He's got the year wrong, and it's possible that he mispronounces the name of the factory. That's not the important detail. It's a legend. It's a tradition. It sits behind who I am and who my parents were. He describes the grandfather as a person who begins as der Lamden, as a learned Jew who becomes a socialist martyr. That evolution is the name of the game. That's the story we're telling over time. And then the grandfather is officially humiliated, sent back to his shtetl in Caton, in chains. The conclusion that might be surprising if you didn't know the context is that this is a source of pride. This humiliation is a source of pride. Why? To be sent back in Caton, he insists on including the Yiddish word, which is precisely in Yiddish, the word that Karl Marx uses at the famous conclusion to the manifesto. Workers, you have nothing to lose but your chains. And I reread the Yiddish manifesto recently. Zayach Caton, you have nothing to lose but your chains and a world to win. It becomes a source of pride to have been humiliated by the Tsarist government, which incidentally governed Poland at that time. And yet, when George Watt, who grew up as Israel Kvat, went to Spain, he went as George Watt. Bill Sussman went as Bill Ellis. When George Watt is explaining his name change, he says that he was convinced to change his name by his friend Joe Clark, and then adds, who was Joe Cohen at the time? So what do we have? We have a bunch of Jewish guys raised in the Yiddish language, all native speakers of Yiddish, incidentally, and in a Jewish brand of socialism, becoming instant Anglo-Saxons when they become activists in the party. Now, George explained it. He said it was a little bit of a romantic gesture. The Russians did it. Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky, they all assumed revolutionary names, but Anglo-Saxon, a little peculiar. The Communist Party was obscuring its foreign connections, its foreign origins, and its Jewish membership. Let me read you what Abe Osheroff said. Now, for those of you who saw the movie, Abe is the first face you see with a hammer in his hand, pounding nails into a wall. He was a lifelong carpenter. What you're going to hear is a man who was also very refined, self-educated. And so what he says sounds better than what I could say, the professor. In practice, he says, the party established a Yiddish newspaper and a few journals that were instruments of the Communist Party. But in some ways, it was a two-faced policy. On one hand, it did everything it could to organize Jewish workers. On the other hand, there was constant pressure on Jews in the party, particularly those who were rising to leadership, to give in to the pressures of assimilation, which the society in general was practicing. A.B. Osheroff, they said, couldn't organize steel workers, not as A.B. Osheroff, at least. Well, in his case, he did not change his name, and he organized steel workers, mostly by arm wrestling with them to show that he was their equal. When the Lincolns, many of them Jewish, went to Spain, they found that, as I say, 20% of the internationals were Jewish, Yiddish speakers. Yiddish became, for many of them, a kind of lingua franca at the front. They could speak to colleagues from other countries. They could speak to Germans via the Yiddish and German connection. There was one significant alternative in Spain, and that was the Butwin battalion, or the Butwin company, as it's called, in the Polish Dąbrowski company or battalion, a Yiddish section in which Yiddish was the language commonly used, and used, among other things, for the publication of a newspaper. Here, the Gesundung, the farewell issue, as the vets are leaving Spain. I should add that the name at the top in Yiddish, which many of you can read, Butwin, is actually my family name. The names changed, but I want to emphasize that the spirit and the ideology did not. George Watt, at the end of our interview, which turned out to be very near the end of our lives, says that acknowledges that the name changes were a trend at the time, but I feel bad about it at this time. He wanted to talk about Jewishness, or as he would have said, about Yiddishkeit. And yet, when he went to Spain, George Watt wrote home to his parents in their own language, in the Mameluschen, in Yiddish. Thank you. Now to my old friend, Nancy Wallach.
Thank you, Joe. Hello, my name is Nancy Wallach, and I'm very pleased to be here today as a member of the governing board of ALBA and to carry on their educational mission to keep alive the extraordinary example of the American volunteers who laid their lives on the line when fascism was on the rise in Spain. As a part of this effort, I'm glad to be able to share my own oral history about my father, Hy Wallach, who was a veteran of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. My father was a first generation American, and as the information recorded at the time his family immigrated to America indicates, it said, Chaim David Wallach, at the age of 6, whose last residence was the Polish town of Tokochin, departed from Copenhagen on the ship Helig Olav and arrived in New York on December 6, 1920. And the town he arrived from was on the border between Poland and Russia, and it was overrun by troops during World War I. But fortunately, as my father remembered it, both sides liked indulging in my grandmother's latkes. My father's grandfather, Shmuel, was the grand rabbi in their shtetl, as my father was a Koyan, a Cohen, a descendant of Aaron, the hereditary high priest. Our next door neighbor in Brooklyn, my father's uncle, was a cantor. So my father came from an Orthodox Jewish Yiddish-speaking family. And as Alva Bessie wrote in his firsthand account of the Lincoln's men in battle, my father was using his Yiddish to speak to the volunteers from many different nationalities whom he met up with on the train to Paris, where they would then cross the Pyrenees to Spain. And the German that he learned in high school was also easy to acquire due to his Yiddish background. And he would use that language as well to communicate with the Yiddish-speaking brigadistas he met in Spain, the non-Yiddish-speaking brigadistas he met in Spain, such as the Yugoslav partisan Radivoj Nikolic. You can see some of the Jewish traditions he came out of at these photos from my parents' wedding, where klezmer musicians played the music they danced the Horah to, and my parents received a blessing, the Baruch, or from the rabbi, although the wedding incorporated another tradition, as they had crossed canes in a military ceremony because my father had fought in Spain. And like many immigrant children whose first language was not English, my father took to spelling as a youngster with a great zeal, and then later in life to public speaking. And he was a great admirer of Hemingway's modern, terse literary style, long before he knew of the author's sympathy for the Spanish Republic. I'd like to respond to the question Joe posed to many of the Lincoln vets he interviewed, which was, to paraphrase, what brought you to Spain? How did your background contribute to your motivation and form the beliefs you acted on in going to Spain? My father spent his formative years in both the tenements of the Lower East Side and Brownsville, Brooklyn, which, as Joe writes about, was where the majority of Jewish volunteers in New York City came from. My father often mentioned the coming of age story, Jews Without Money, by Mike Gold. The title, Jews Without Money, was in itself a rebuke to the stereotype of Jews as bankers and moneylenders, the scapegoats for the poverty of the Depression. And for my father, this was one of those books in which you feel the author has been living right alongside you, so accurately does he capture everything you experienced. My grandfather was even a house painter like the protagonist's father in Gold's novel. And the novel concludes with the line, "Oh, revolution, that forced me to think, to struggle, and to live." And like Gold's hero, my father found hope and redemption from the soul-crushing poverty of these tenements through his radicalization in the labor and the socialist movement. My father became an organizer in the shipping clerks union in the garment industry in the 1930s, and it was coming straight out of his leadership in this industry-wide general strike that he formed the very deep determination to go to Spain, which he considered the most decisive moral issue of his time. My father fought on the Aragon front in the battles of Brigade, Quinto, Fuentes del Ebro, Teruel, and Gandesa. And after his first week at officers training school, the entire school had to be sent to the front lines near Gandesa to stop the world's first blitzkrieg, which was threatening to cut the Republic in two. And after that battle, in which they lost their officers, Dave Duran and Robert Merriman, my father evaded capture for 7 days behind enemy lines, but was captured by Italian fascists and spent the next 17 months in the fascist concentration camp San Pedro de Cardena in Burgos. And because he believed there was inspiration to be drawn from the story of the International Brigade prisoners at San Pedro, my father spoke about and shared his resistance to fascism, not only on the battlefields of Spain and later in the US Fifth Army, but also the resistance put up by the International Brigade prisoners in that living hell that was the concentration camp at San Pedro de Cardena, which one Spanish historian referred to as having infrahuman living conditions, a preview of Dachau or Buchenwald. And we're looking at a slide of my father speaking of his experiences as a former International Brigade prisoner at the Café Obrero Español in 1945, which was a gathering place for the Spanish community in New York City. He's on the dais in the right-hand corner, and he was asked to share his story in order to expose the fascist brutality that Franco continued to impose on the Spanish people. And you can see one of the banners reads, "Try Franco as a war criminal." And interestingly, my father maintained lifelong friendships with the men he was imprisoned with, which I'm convinced is because of the self-respect and the respect they had for one another in being able to maintain their humanity, even as they resisted the worst efforts of the fascists to degrade and demoralize and dehumanize them. And my father, like many Eastern European Jews on both sides of the Atlantic, came from a family of chess players. And he brought this part of his cultural heritage to the efforts to form an underground at San Pedro. My father wrote, quote, "In San Pedro, we were faced with miserable conditions, beatings, and fascist propaganda. We thought it was necessary to have a functioning communist party in order to counteract these conditions in an organized way and to keep alive the spirit and the purpose we came for, to continue our struggle against fascism. Initially, we were not allowed to get together or even speak, but we met under the guise of a chess club. And the influence of the party was best manifested when we were required to respond to the questionnaires issued to us by the fascists. Overwhelmingly, the prisoners reasserted we had come to Spain to fight against fascism. And this questionnaire would have been administered at the point they were captured. There was a great deal of intimidation put on them to renounce the Republic, to denounce the anti-fascism that they had come for. And so my father was justly proud that they resisted that. And then he went on to say, we created a newspaper, the Daily News, edited by Sidney Rosenblatt, Bob Steck, and myself. And here are 3 examples of the lone surviving fragments of that underground newspaper. I want to credit Len Su with unearthing the 2 on the left of these very rare fragments of all that survives. And you'll see in the underlined areas, there were chess columns, one called Kings and Pawns. There's one in the earlier one. And then you'll see my father's name underlined in another Kings and Pawns. And they gave prizes to people who solved the chess problems. And then there's another quiz at the bottom. Do you know this man? And that's not a chess quiz, but it's a morale boosting quiz, which was so important in this underground newspaper, aside from the heavier political things. And that would have been a quiz about identifying somebody. And apparently my father's name is underlined because he was the one that was the answer to last week's quiz. But chess not only served as a means to meet and organize, but it became an important part of the camp life as a morale booster, as a way to break down the language barriers and to take one's mind off of the hunger, the filth, and the constant barrage of beatings. So chess, this element of Eastern European Jewish culture, helped these starved, lice-infested prisoners be reminded of their humanity and intellect and spirit, which their fascist captors were constantly trying to break down. So I'd like to come full circle back to what Joe says was the impetus for his interviews, George Watt's concern that not enough was known about the Jews who fought Hitler long before the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And like George Watt, my father also felt very strongly that more needs to be told about the early resistance to Hitler, including the militant traditions of the Jewish anti-fascists. And my father developed the greatest respect for the comrades he fought alongside in Spain, though they were early, although definitely not premature anti-fascists in the international brigades, and the even earlier resistance of many of the German comrades in the Tailman battalion that they formed to Hitler. The German comrades, both Jewish and non-Jewish, whom my father would have had greatest, closest contact with, were those he was in San Pedro with, for whom the fascist authorities reserved the harshest of treatment. He wrote about one such prisoner, quote, "A man who called himself Carlson, supposedly a Swedish seaman, actually he was German. He'd been the military commander of the Red Front Fighters Bund. He was #1 on Hitler's list, as the only two that would be put above him, Ernest Thälmann and Edgar Andre, were in the hands of the fascists. Although the Gestapo was in San Pedro, Carlson was never detected. He left San Pedro and fascist Spain with the Swedes. And parenthetically, that is a tribute to the solidarity of the International Brigade prisoners who protected his and the other German prisoners' identity from immediate either execution or torture. And as a result of his experience in the brigades, my father had a particular antipathy to the tendency in the media and in popular culture, in the fervor of post-World War II victory, to use the word German as interchangeable with the word Nazi, to stereotype all Germans as cartoonish villains with sinister accents. And my father was particularly sensitive to the dangers that could come from this kind of ethnic stereotyping and prejudices against an entire people, precisely because he was Jewish and saw its culmination in the horrors of the Holocaust. And he felt that such an analysis of Nazism as a byproduct of German national character did little to add to an understanding of what fascism is, or to honor its earliest resistors. So as we've now come to the post-World War II era, that slide that we had been looking at demonstrates the continued commitment the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade showed to opposing fascism in Spain and warning the world of its consequences, as one of those posters, with the slide which showed them in uniforms, had a poster that said, "Our veterans don't want a third world war." So I'm concluding now by pointing out that this program today coincides with memorials to the international brigades that are being held all over the world to mark the 85th anniversary of the uprising which led to the Spanish Civil War. And my father regarded the war against fascism in Spain as the defining moment for his generation, the most decisive moral issue of his time. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. That was really fascinating to hear about your father's personal history. And we are going to get to discussion and final thoughts. A note to the audience, we will run a little bit long today, maybe about 10 minutes long. So please stay an extra 10 minutes if you can. Right now, I want to take the floor back just to tell you a little bit about our upcoming programs. So next week, we are focusing on Abba Kovner, who was the leader of the partisans of Vilna. And we are going to be showing the film by that name, the celebrated film, in conjunction with that program. And then we will be meeting Abba Kovner's son, Michael Kovner, who's a celebrated Israeli painter. We'll be also meeting Dina Porat, who is Abba Kovner's biographer. She's written 2 books about him, and she's the chief historian at Yad Vashem. That program will be moderated by our own Mordechai Paldiel from our board of directors, who was for 25 years at Yad Vashem as director of the Department for the Righteous. Now, many of our programs are free, like today's program. Most of our programs are free. Next week's program, there is a donation that's requested. We do suggest the number of 18 or high, but please give whatever is comfortable for you. And we hope you will join us. Here is the trailer for the film Partisans of Vilna.
היטלר זמן להשמיד את כל יהודי אירופה. על יהודי ליטא יצא להיות בגורלם בתור ראשון. אמת נכון, אנחנו חלשים וחסרי מגן, אבל התשובה היחידה לרוצח היא התגוננות. אחים, מוטב ליפול כלוחמים בני חורין מאשר לחיות בחסד המרצחים. להתגונן, להתגונן עד נשימתנו האחרונה.
גזירות חדשות מדי יום, משפילות, מדכאות, חטיפות. בתור ילדה צעירה אולי עוד לא זוכרת שתפסתי, הרגשתי רק את ההשפלה. למה אני צריכה להיות מסומנת בטלאי צהוב? מדוע אסור ללכת על המדרכה בווילנה שלי, בעיר שגדלתי?
Der Ziel zu der Gegenstellung im Ghetto, verteidigen den jüdischen Covid, führen einen Sabotageakt, herüberführen dem dosigen Gedanken.
ואז החלטנו לפוצץ רכבת, כדבר ראשון.
כששמנו רק את הפצצה, מהר ברחנו, וכשרצנו בדרך שמענו את הפיצוץ מרחוק.
המעניין לציין הוא, כשאירע הפיצוץ, אז בעיתונות המחתרת ואחרת, ליטאים אמרו שעשו את זה, פולנים אמרו שעשו את זה, איש לא עלה בדעתו שעשתה איזה בחורה, ועם כמה בחורים מתוך הגטו.
Die jüdische Partisaner sind gewöhnt zu werfen in die verschiedenen Einheiten, russische, litwische, polnische. Wenn sie gekommen, Glasmann mit seiner Gruppe, hat Glasmann zusammen mit den Chaveren genommen, organisiert eine jüdische Einheit, welche soll verschreiben, vernotieren, die jüdische Gewürre auf Verhältnis von jüdischem Volk.
הגענו לווילנה המשוחררת, ואני זוכרת את עצמי הולכת ברחוב, מולי הולכת אישה וילד, ופתאום אני שומעת מדברים יידיש. ואני, שהייתי אז די נוקשה, אני חושבת שבמשך כל זמן היה לא בכיתי, כמו שלא צחקתי, פתאום נעמדתי באמצע הרחוב, ופרצתי בבכי קולני. זה היה כל כך מפתיע בפני עצמי. קודם כל, אני נדהמתי שאני מסוגלת לבכות. כמו שפעם נדהמתי שאני עוד מסוגלת לצחוק. אבל זה קשה בכלל להבין, שאני זכיתי לראות ילד יהודי חי.
עלה בדעתנו שאנחנו סתם ניכנע, ואנחנו לא נכנענו.
Great. So please sign up for that program. You will receive an email after today's program with information about this next Sunday's program and the programs to come. So now, Gina, let me turn the floor back to you for a little bit of discussion with our speakers, and then afterwards, their final thoughts. Gina, take it away.
Thank you. Can you all hear me well?
Yes.
I have been really enjoying looking at some of the comments that came through the chat. Thank you to Nancy and Joe for your really compelling and moving presentations that brought a little tear to my eye in both instances. There are one question that has come up it wasn't a question, it was an observation in the chat, is the establishment of workers' circle synagogues, shuls. And I'm wondering if in either of your cases, the vets participated in this leftist religious or leftist observant Jewish type of community.
May I speak?
Yes, please.
Thank you. A lot of the people I spoke to, and indeed an entire generation of Jews on the left, were associated with the Arbeiterring, the workman's circle. In part, it was an insurance company, but also a cultural center, which had its shul. And I think that to my understanding, the word shul, shulen, applies more to the schools that they sponsored than to the pious use of the word shul to mean school, shul, synagogue. So it was, if for many of them it was a secular equivalent, but and some of the people I spoke to would admit to having had, as I'm prepared to admit myself, a Reiten Seder, a red Seder in their youth. For the most part, there was very little religious practice among the people that I spoke to, and very little effort at an equivalent. So I would look to the Arbeiterring more as a cultural organization, as it served through its schulen, which were schools more than replacement synagogues. That's at least my understanding.
Nancy?
Just to add to that, I know Joe spoke of the generation of George Watt attending these shulas, and it continued. I know my sister attended shula, and many of my friends did, and it was that they were learning Yiddish as a living language, as opposed to the more the secular language, Hebrew, which would have been, I guess, the equivalent of speaking Italian rather than Latin, and learning it. So I do know it went on into my generation as well.
Thank you. So Nancy, that leads directly into my next question, and that is for both you and Joe, was there any awareness among the Jewish vets that it would be valuable to pass on Yiddish to the next generations? So did these men and women practice, cultivate, continue, cherish their own Yiddish? What was the relationship of the language to their both to their heritage, but also their continuing leftist Jewish culture?
I'll start, if I may. Aside from learning Yiddish in Shula, I went to, and many of the Lincoln Vets kids went to Camp Kinderland, and we learned Yiddish culture. And we also, interestingly, we would put on plays about Muttel in the New World, these Shalom Aleichem's characters. And but interestingly, we also learned African-American history. We learned about the Underground Railroad, and way before it was introduced into the public schools. So it was kind of a very rich cultural background that we got in the summer camps as well. So it definitely was a goal to preserve or respect, and we learned folk songs in Yiddish, but we also learned spirituals, we learned protest songs. So we were getting an aspect of a culture that wasn't necessarily transmitted to the mainstream, and we were the richer for it.
I can echo everything that Nancy just said, with the subtle difference that I didn't grow up in the valley of the Hudson River. And I think it's significant that both Nancy and I are bringing our learning, our scholarship to the event today, but it's a learning and scholarship which began as it did for the people we're studying in our childhood. In other words, this is very different from my work in English literature. Enough said. George Watt spoke to me on that very issue when we talked, and indeed, as we were leaving, and he showed me pictures on the mantelpiece of his grandchildren. He said that his father told him that he wanted his son George, Izzy, Yitzhak, to go to Yiddish, to study Yiddish, because it was his language, his father's language. He wanted to be able to communicate. Then he added that he didn't expect that his grandchildren, this is George's father, would know the language. They wouldn't need it, he said. They're going to be Americans. You and I need it. And George, pointing to the pictures of his grandchildren on the mantle as I was walking out, said, and this was a little wistful, I'm not sure they know they're Jewish. And I think both of our faces fell a little bit, and that may not be accurate. My quotation is, but his assessment may not be. I think that they did not expect necessarily continuation of basically the two worlds of immigrant culture beyond me, Nancy. My own parents were translators of Yiddish, and of course I was exposed to the language.
Excellent.
So Nancy, I know that you have another slide you'd like to show us. I think this is the time to show it.
Okay, and again, thank you for giving us the opportunity to tell, well, not only my individual story, but this important neglected story that of the earliest fight against fascism that's so relevant today. So I'd like to share a letter which my father used the salutation, Salud y Victoria, in an email he sent home when he was serving overseas in the Fifth Army. He was in Sicily. And Joe explained that many of the Lincoln vets used this in letters home from Spain and later in Europe and the Pacific, where they served in World War II. And I'd like to share an excerpt from this email because it also contains my father's explanation in his own words of why he went to fight against fascism, that very key question, not only in Spain, but later in Italy and North Africa. And it was addressed to an actual Victoria, my sister, on the occasion of her second birthday, whom my father had seen very little of since he was overseas. Dearest Vicky, congratulations on your second birthday. They tell me you're quite a young lady and that your progress is amazing. And that's as it should be, sweetheart, for you are a part of the first generation of a new world, a world as bright and beautiful as you are. As a matter of fact, it can be neither more than or less than that. And this world and everything in it is a reflection of the people that inhabit it, a simple truth. And to your generation, it will be obvious. But that is because this people's war that your father, mother, and their generation are engaged in will have been won. And that is what we are fighting for, the historic task of our generation to make this a people's world. You see, darling, we're taking the world away from the greedy few and giving it to you. It is wonderful and something worth dying for, but with it carries great responsibilities. You'll have the greater task of running the world and you must be equal to it. But above all, you must learn to appreciate one another and work together. For that is the way the world is going to run. And on the extent of it, does our future progress depend. And now for your birthday, I want to make you the promise that, my darling, this year we shall see the first concrete signs of your world with the defeat of fascism in Europe, and go on from there to the utter destruction of fascism everywhere. This is the least we can do before we give way to your generation, who will construct a bright new world on new foundations where man's inhumanity to man will no longer exist. And so on your second birthday, your father salutes you and the future. And in our fight for the freedom of Spain, we learn to express these things with the words, Salud y Victoria. Thank you.
Salud.
Joe,
So
do you have some final words you would like to say to our audience, Joe?
I simply want to say that we discussed this program individually and separately, and it does more than fulfill my wishes. And right now, my tears were also welling up with that final letter of Nancy's. So I simply want to say, Salud y Shalom.
Gina, the floor is yours.
I just want to thank this remarkable audience. This is a wonderful and rich turnout, and I'm following the conversation in the chat. I've listed a short bibliography that addresses a number of the questions that have been asked, including related to the fate of Jews who passed through Spain. How did they get through Spain during Franco's Spain? I also recommended Peter Carroll's book about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and finally a new edited volume on Spain, World War II, and the Holocaust. I direct you to those texts because I believe that they represent the intersections of some of the rich histories that we've been discussing here today. And I want to thank Olivia again for making the connection with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archive. I hope that I see some of you audience members at Abraham Lincoln events, and likewise that the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archive constituents will be tuning into the wonderful podcast series that Olivia and her organization put together at a pace during COVID that I can't imagine how they do it. So I would say, I'm being told that I need to say Shalom and not Shalom. So with those final directions, thank you, Herschel. Shalom and Salud.
So thanks, Gina. It's been a fascinating program. Thank you for finding Joe and Nancy. What treasures you both are, Joe and
You
Nancy.
are.
And
Thank you.
thank you to our beautiful large audience. And we hope to see you again next week. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.